before the bombs fell and the wasteland was born from the ashes of a burning world. The story of the Brotherhood of Steel began not in the dust and ruins of the post-apocalyptic age, but in the sterile corridors of pre-war laboratories and military bunkers, where the ambitions of the United States government and its closest private contractors set into motion a chain of events that would reverberate for centuries. Central to this origin was the work conducted at West-Tek, one of the most powerful and influential defense contractors of the late 21st century, which had been commissioned to develop projects at the cutting edge of human augmentation, weapons design, and advanced protective technology, particularly the now iconic power armor that would become synonymous with the Brotherhood itself. Yet at the heart of West-Tek's most dangerous undertakings was the Forced Evolutionary Virus, or FEV, an experimental agent that would come to define not only the fate of the Brotherhood, but the trajectory of humanity in the post-war world. The FEV's roots stretched back to the New Plague, a devastating epidemic that swept across the United States beginning in 2052, leaving tens of thousands dead and prompting the government to take extreme action, both out of genuine desperation and out of the convenient opportunity the crisis provided to justify expanded militarization, tighter control of information, and immense federal contracts for corporations like West-Tek, whose scientists were tasked with developing a universal inoculation, an endeavor that would eventually lead to the discovery of FEV's mutagenic properties when applied under controlled laboratory conditions. Though the true motivations of the military were never limited to curing a disease, from the beginning, the government saw the project as a chance to reshape humanity itself into the ultimate soldier, a being immune to radiation, disease, and weakness, capable of thriving in environments uninhabitable for ordinary humans. And to this end, the experiments at the clandestine Mariposa military base in California became the focal point of one of the most morally reprehensible pre-war programs in American history. The development of power armor paralleled the work on FEV, and the two projects would come to define the relationship between West-Tek scientists and the military officers overseeing them. As the resource wars of the 21st century reached their peak, with dwindling oil reserves driving nations into open conflict, and the United States seizing control of Alaska's crude fields while fending off Chinese incursions, it became clear that warfare in the modern era would not be waged solely by numbers of troops, but by the technological edge one side could hold over the other, and West-Tek's revolutionary T-45 power armor provided just that, granting soldiers the strength to carry heavy weapons, endure direct small arms fire, and operate in hostile environments, including the icy tundra of Alaska, where American forces launched Operation Anchorage to repel the People's Liberation Army. The success of power armor not only ensured West-Tek's continued dominance in military contracting, but also forged a deep bond between its engineers and the officers entrusted with field deployment, among them a decorated soldier by the name of Captain Roger Maxson, a man whose strict sense of duty, loyalty to his men, and moral clarity would come to shape the Brotherhood of Steel after the Great War, though in those days he could not have foreseen the role destiny had set for him. Maxson's command eventually brought him into close contact with West-Tek scientists assigned to Mariposa, where research into FEV had expanded under the utmost secrecy. Justified to military overseers as a vital national security project, yet hidden from many of the soldiers themselves, was the deeply unethical nature of the work. Experiments on unwilling human subjects, political dissidents, prisoners, and the desperate, all conducted in the name of creating a new breed of soldier immune to the terrors of the wasteland, the military feared was inevitable. In a world teetering on the brink of nuclear annihilation, the seeds of the Brotherhood were therefore planted not in a single moment, but across years of growing disillusionment, as soldiers stationed at Mariposa began to learn fragments of what the scientists under West-Tek were truly attempting. And while most men simply obeyed orders, Captain Maxson found his convictions tested in ways few military officers of the time could endure. The closer he came to the truth, the more the ideal of the United States he served clashed with the reality of what his government was willing to do. For although patriotism ran deep in Maxson's veins, it was not blind devotion. He believed in service, honor, and protection of the innocent. But when he discovered the extent of human experimentation occurring under his watch, he felt not only betrayed by the chain of command, but morally obligated to act, and it was this obligation that would become the spark from which the Brotherhood's ideology of technological stewardship and moral superiority would arise, albeit twisted by generations of successors who interpreted Maxson's decisions through the lens of their own beliefs. Yet, before that schism between vision and reality, Maxson was simply a soldier confronted with undeniable proof of atrocities. West-Tek itself, prior to the war, had become nearly untouchable, its scientists shielded by layers of government secrecy, and its funding guaranteed by the endless spiral of militarization. And while some of its work, such as the cure for the new plague, or advanced weapon systems like energy rifles, was justified as critical to national defense, the Mariposa program was the culmination of the corporation's moral bankruptcy. Official documents labeled it as Project Safehouse, in some cases, to obscure its true purpose. And while Vault-Tec was publicly known for its network of survival shelters, themselves often little more than grotesque social experiments, thinly veiled as civil defense measures, West-Tek's viral research remained shrouded in the kind of classification that even many generals were not fully aware of, and thus it fell to individuals like Maxson, placed directly in command of the facility's garrison, to bear witness to truths hidden from the broader military establishment. In doing so, Maxson came face to face with the dangerous intersection of science, politics, and war that had brought America to the brink of annihilation, and his personal reckoning at Mariposa became inseparable from the larger collapse of civilization that followed in October 2077, when nuclear fire consumed the world. By the time the bombs fell, the pattern had already been set. Corporations like West-Tek, enabled by a desperate and authoritarian government, had pursued technological supremacy at all costs, justifying horrors in the name of national security. And it was from this cauldron of secrecy and corruption that the Brotherhood of Steel would emerge, not as a nation-state or a simple military order, but as a cultural and ideological legacy carried forward by survivors who could not bear to return to the old world's sins. Captain Maxson, standing at the fulcrum of this transition, represented both the best and worst of pre-war America. A man trained in its militarism, bound by its loyalty to command, yet unwilling to surrender his moral compass to blind obedience, and the soldiers under his leadership would come to follow him not because he was their superior officer, but because he had shown them that when the state failed its people, it fell to individuals to carry forward the torch of civilization. This was the origin of the Brotherhood, not yet formalized, not yet clad in the iconography of gears and swords, but alive in the quiet act of defiance that would soon shatter the authority of a dying government. And though the world would burn in nuclear fire, the legacy of West-Tek's laboratories and Maxson's rebellion would endure, carried into the wasteland by men and women who believed that technology was both mankind's greatest danger and its only salvation, a paradox that would shape centuries of Brotherhood history to come. When the Great War finally erupted on the 23rd of October 2077, the culmination of decades of escalating tensions, proxy battles, and unchecked militarization, the world was engulfed in nuclear fire, so swift and absolute that most of humanity had no time to comprehend that their lives were ending. Yet while cities crumbled and millions were incinerated in a matter of minutes, at the remote Mariposa military base in Northern California, the garrison under the command of Captain Roger Maxson was spared the immediate annihilation, their isolated desert location protecting them from the full fury of the bombardment. And within the bunker walls, Maxson and his soldiers were left not with death, but with revelation, for only days earlier he had discovered incontrovertible evidence of the heinous experiments being conducted by West-Tek scientists under military contract, a truth that had shattered his faith in the chain of command and led him to the grim conclusion that the United States government had not only sanctioned atrocities, but had willingly sacrificed its humanity in pursuit of power. When the bombs fell, Maxson's first response was not celebration or panic, but confirmation, for he had already concluded that the America he had sworn to serve had ceased to exist long before nuclear fire tore apart its cities, replaced instead by a shadow state that thrived on secrecy, manipulation, and disregard for human dignity. And so it was in the wake of this destruction that Maxson acted decisively, stripping the scientists of their authority, interrogating them under threat of execution, and finally ordering their summary deaths for crimes against humanity. A controversial and defining moment that marked the point of no return for him and his men, for in killing the scientists, Maxson severed the last tie between his command and the government that had issued his orders, leaving him with only his soldiers, his conscience, and the wilderness of a devastated world in which to chart a new path. The execution of the Mariposa scientists is remembered as both a necessary act of justice and the moment the Brotherhood of Steel was born, though at the time neither Maxson nor his troops could have known that their decision would echo across centuries. Many of the men were torn, trained since youth to obey orders and respect authority, and yet they could not deny the evidence Maxson placed before them: records of test subjects subjected to forced exposure to the forced evolutionary virus, humans twisted into grotesque mutants, and entire cohorts of prisoners effectively murdered in the name of science. And so when Maxson pulled the trigger, it was as much a signal to his men as it was a punishment to the guilty, a demonstration that their captain would no longer follow a corrupt system, and that the mantle of moral responsibility now fell upon them alone. In the weeks that followed, as the world outside burned, Maxson consolidated control of the Mariposa base, broadcasting a declaration over military channels in which he announced that he and his command were seceding from the United States and denouncing the government as irredeemably corrupt, a bold proclamation that may have never been heard, given the state of communications after the nuclear strikes, but which nonetheless symbolized the final break between Maxson and the authority he once served, and in this act of rebellion lay the seeds of the Brotherhood's identity: independence from corrupt leadership, reverence for truth over obedience, and belief in the need to preserve what could still be saved from the wreckage of the old world. Life at Mariposa, in the immediate aftermath of the Great War, was a fragile existence, as supplies dwindled and contact with other military units proved impossible, and Maxson knew that his men could not remain in the base indefinitely. especially with the taint of the FEV research lingering in every laboratory and chamber, its containment systems unmonitored, and its dangers unknown. He feared that the virus could not only compromise his troops, but spread unchecked into the wasteland beyond, and thus, after weeks of deliberation, he made the fateful decision to abandon the facility, taking with him his soldiers, their families, and such technology as they could reasonably carry. For, unlike many others who viewed technology as a weapon of domination or a luxury of convenience, Maxson had begun to perceive it as humanity's only lifeline in a ruined world, a conviction born from his experience at Mariposa and the destruction he knew lay beyond the base's perimeter. With disciplined order, the garrison began its exodus into the California wasteland, forming a caravan of armored soldiers, frightened civilians, and salvaged military equipment that wound its way through a landscape of devastation. The once prosperous nation now reduced to irradiated deserts, shattered infrastructure, and roaming bands of desperate survivors, some hostile and some broken, all struggling to understand the enormity of what had been lost. This journey, remembered as the Exodus to Lost Hills, was a crucible that tested Maxson's leadership and the resolve of his people, for they were not merely soldiers following a commander, but families uprooted from everything they had known, facing the unknown in a world stripped bare of its familiar comforts. Disease, radiation, and raiders claimed lives along the way, and morale wavered as the scope of the catastrophe became undeniable. Yet Maxson held his people together, with a vision that transcended survival. He told them that they were not merely refugees, but the inheritors of humanity's last chance, chosen not by destiny, but by circumstance, to carry forward the flame of civilization, and that by preserving knowledge, protecting technology, and upholding discipline, they could ensure that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated. Such rhetoric was not empty, for Maxson himself embodied the principles he preached, leading from the front, sharing the hardships of his men, and showing a willingness to adapt when rigid military doctrine threatened to fracture his fledgling community. And in this manner, he transformed from a captain of soldiers into the patriarch of a movement that would become the Brotherhood of Steel. Their arrival at the Lost Hills bunker, an unfinished military installation designed as part of the nation's wider system of defense and continuity of government facilities, marked the moment when the Brotherhood's physical and ideological foundation was secured. Located in the mountains of Southern California, Lost Hills offered defensible terrain, pre-war infrastructure, and the potential for expansion. And here, Maxson declared that his people would build anew, not as a branch of the military, but as a self-sustaining order dedicated to the preservation of technology and the safeguarding of knowledge. For he had come to believe that humanity's greatest danger was not only the bombs that had already fallen, but the reckless pursuit of power that had led to their deployment. And so the Brotherhood's earliest doctrine emerged. Technology must be preserved, studied, and controlled, not for the indulgence of individuals or the chaos of governments, but for the disciplined stewardship of those strong enough to resist its temptations. This belief, rooted in Maxson's disillusionment and crystallized in the suffering of the Exodus, would shape the Brotherhood's culture for centuries, passed down from elder to initiate as the core justification for their existence, even as later generations twisted or reinterpreted it to suit their own ambitions. Maxson's transformation from captain to elder, a title adopted to symbolize the shift from military hierarchy to quasi-religious stewardship, cemented his authority over the Brotherhood, and with his ascension came the formal establishment of rituals, codes, and practices that bound the survivors of the Exodus into a coherent order. They were no longer merely soldiers or refugees, but brothers and sisters in a sacred mission, clad in salvaged power armor, armed with the finest weaponry of the old world, and driven by the conviction that they alone stood between humanity and the repetition of its greatest folly. And while they lacked the numbers to rebuild civilization in its entirety, they did not see this as their role. Instead, they envisioned themselves as guardians, custodians of a sacred trust, prepared to outlast the chaos of the wasteland, and one day guide the remnants of humanity toward a future not defined by reckless ambition or unchecked greed, but by the careful balance of power and responsibility, a vision that, however noble in its origins, would prove both inspiring and divisive in the centuries that followed. Thus, from the ashes of the Great War, the Brotherhood of Steel was born, not in a blaze of glory or a triumphant declaration, but in the quiet march of survivors led by a man who had lost faith in his country, yet found faith in the idea that discipline and stewardship could succeed where nations had failed. The journey from Mariposa to Lost Hills was more than a physical relocation. It was a transformation of identity, a shedding of loyalty to the old order, and the birth of a new one, forged in betrayal, sustained by conviction, and destined to become one of the most influential forces in the post-nuclear wasteland, feared and respected in equal measure, and forever haunted by the paradox that its very survival depended on the same technologies that had nearly destroyed the world. The founding of the Brotherhood of Steel at Lost Hills was not a single ceremonial event, but rather a gradual process of consolidation, ideology, and adaptation as the survivors of Mariposa and the Exodus slowly transformed from a fractured band of soldiers and families into a cohesive order with a shared mission that would come to dominate their identity for generations. And it was here, in the subterranean depths of the unfinished bunker, that Roger Maxson truly emerged, not merely as a military commander, but as a spiritual patriarch, the first elder of a society that no longer identified itself as an arm of the United States government, or even as a military unit, but as something entirely new, born from the ashes of the old world, and destined to chart its own path through the wasteland. In those early days, survival remained the first priority, for although the bunker provided protection from the dangers of radiation and raiders, the infrastructure was incomplete, supplies were limited, and the long-term viability of the settlement depended on the ability of the community to adapt, innovate, and enforce discipline. And Maxson, drawing on his military background, instilled strict order among his people, blending martial hierarchy with an emerging ethos that placed technology at the center of their existence, elevating it from mere tools of war to sacred relics whose preservation and study were seen as vital not only to the Brotherhood's survival, but to the survival of humanity itself. This reverence was no accident, for Maxson had witnessed firsthand the consequences of unchecked scientific ambition at Mariposa, and he concluded that only through careful stewardship could humanity hope to avoid repeating the mistakes that had led to the Great War, thus laying the foundation for the Brotherhood's guiding principle that technology was both mankind's greatest blessing and its greatest curse, and that only a select, disciplined order could be trusted to wield and preserve it. The adoption of the name Brotherhood of Steel symbolized this transformation from a military garrison into an ideological order, and though the precise moment of its naming is clouded in the mists of oral tradition and later embellishment, the spirit behind it was clear. They saw themselves as brothers and sisters united by a common oath. Their steel, not only the literal armor and weapons they carried, but the unyielding strength of their mission, forged in hardship, and purified in the crucible of betrayal and war. The iconography they adopted, the sword and gears, entwined in the wings of a bird of prey, reflected this dual nature, at once martial and technological, embodying their belief that the power of the old world's machines must be tempered by discipline and order, a belief that resonated strongly among the survivors who had seen firsthand the horrors of unrestrained scientific progress in the service of corrupt governments and corporations. Under Maxson's guidance, rituals and codes began to form, blending military discipline with quasi-religious devotion, so that the handling of weapons and the donning of power armor became not only practical acts of survival, but symbolic affirmations of their identity. And in this manner, the Brotherhood transitioned from a loose band of survivors into a culture unto itself, one that was insulated from the chaotic anarchy of the wasteland and bound together by an ideology that gave their suffering purpose. At Lost Hills, the Brotherhood began the painstaking process of cataloging, repairing, and preserving the technology they had carried with them or salvaged from the wasteland, and this practice quickly evolved into their defining function, the hoarding of pre-war relics, not for selfish luxury but for study, maintenance, and, when deemed necessary, deployment, a practice that set them apart from the scavengers, raiders, and desperate settlers who surrounded them in the shattered remnants of California. While other survivors scoured ruins for scraps to barter or consume, the Brotherhood approached every circuit, every firearm, and every suit of armor as irreplaceable artifacts of a lost civilization, pieces of a puzzle that they, and only they, were fit to preserve. And this mentality, though rooted in pragmatism, carried with it a deepening sense of elitism, for the Brotherhood's members came to believe that the wasteland's masses could not be trusted with such power, that to place advanced technology in the hands of undisciplined or morally weak individuals was to court disaster, and thus they withdrew further from the world beyond their bunker, interacting with outsiders only when necessary, and often with an air of superiority that would come to define their reputation throughout the centuries. Yet in these formative years, this isolation was not arrogance, but necessity, for their numbers were too few, their resources too limited, and their mission too fragile to risk entanglement in the chaos of the wider wasteland. Maxson himself underwent a profound transformation during this period, evolving from a hardened soldier into a revered elder, his authority rooted not only in military rank, but in the quasi-spiritual aura he cultivated among his people, for they saw in him a man who had guided them through betrayal, apocalypse, and exodus, a man who had not faltered when confronted with impossible choices, and thus his pronouncements carried the weight of doctrine, shaping the Brotherhood's philosophy for generations. Under his leadership, the Brotherhood began to codify its structure, blending military hierarchy with familial bonds, so that recruits were not merely soldiers but initiates, trained in the lore of technology as much as in the art of war, while veterans became knights, guardians of both knowledge and the community, and leaders ascended to the rank of elder, serving not only as commanders, but as custodians of the Brotherhood's ideological legacy. And in this fusion of martial discipline and religious-like devotion lay the foundation of the Brotherhood's enduring strength, for it provided them with both order and purpose in a world that had lost both. The community that grew at Lost Hills became self-sustaining, expanding the bunker's infrastructure, cultivating food through hydroponics, and establishing systems of governance and education that ensured the continuity of their mission beyond the lives of the original survivors. And though resources remained scarce, the Brotherhood's focus on preservation and repair gave them an edge over the chaotic settlements that dotted the wasteland. For where others consumed and discarded, the Brotherhood maintained and restored, keeping alive the last fragments of pre-war technology in working order, from energy weapons to medical devices. And in doing so, they gradually built a stockpile of power that made them formidable even in their isolation. Yet this stockpiling also sowed the seeds of future conflict, for outsiders who encountered the Brotherhood often viewed their hoarding as selfishness, unable to understand or unwilling to accept the Order's conviction that technology in the wrong hands posed a greater threat than ignorance itself, and this tension between stewardship and sharing would haunt the Brotherhood's interactions with the wasteland for centuries. As the years passed, and the children of the Exodus grew into adulthood, the Brotherhood's identity solidified into a culture all its own. One in which reverence for technology was taught alongside basic survival skills, and where every initiate was indoctrinated into the belief that they were the last bulwark against humanity's self-destruction. Oral traditions began to crystallize into written records. The story of Maxson's rebellion at Mariposa and the journey to Lost Hills elevated into foundational myth. And while the horrors of the past were remembered as cautionary tales, they were also recast as validation of the Brotherhood's mission, proof that without their stewardship, mankind would inevitably destroy itself again. This process of mythologizing their origins imbued the Brotherhood with a sense of destiny, a belief that their survival was not merely chance, but necessity, and that their mission was not one choice among many, but the only path forward for humanity. And it was this belief that sustained them as the chaos of the wasteland deepened around them, with raider tribes rising and falling, settlements struggling to rebuild, and mutated creatures prowling the ruins of the old world. Roger Maxson's death in 2135 marked the end of an era, but not the end of his influence, for by the time of his passing, the Brotherhood was firmly established as an enduring order, its structure and ideology entrenched in the hearts of its members, and his son, Maxson II, succeeded him as elder, continuing the legacy of stewardship and discipline that his father had set in motion. In this succession lay the beginning of a dynastic tradition that would see the Maxson line elevated to near-legendary status, revered as the sacred guardians of the Brotherhood's mission and ideals, a reverence that bordered on worship and ensured continuity of leadership even as the world beyond Lost Hills remained fractured and hostile. And though future elders would diverge in their interpretations of the Brotherhood's purpose, the foundational principles established by Roger Maxson at Lost Hills endured as a guiding light, defining the Brotherhood not merely as a military order, but as a cultural force whose influence would stretch across centuries and continents. Thus, the founding of the Brotherhood of Steel at Lost Hills was more than the creation of a faction in the wasteland. It was the birth of an enduring ideology, a community bound together by reverence for technology, disciplined hierarchy, and a sense of destiny, forged in the crucible of betrayal and apocalypse, and destined to shape the fate of the post-nuclear world. What began as a band of survivors became an order. What began as a bunker became a sanctuary, and what began as the conviction of one man became the doctrine of generations. And in this transformation lay the true founding of the Brotherhood, a force at once noble and arrogant, selfless and self-serving, guardians and hoarders, whose contradictions would define their role in the wasteland for centuries to come. The ascendance of the Brotherhood of Steel in California marked the period when the Order transitioned from a fragile community of survivors clinging to the Lost Hills bunker into the most powerful and feared faction in the post-war West, an evolution driven by their disciplined stewardship of technology. Their mastery of power, armor, and energy weapons, and their refusal to compromise their ideals in a wasteland dominated by chaos, raiders, and the desperate remnants of humanity. In the centuries following the Great War, as the wasteland around them struggled to claw its way towards survival, the Brotherhood consolidated its position, transforming Lost Hills into a fortress state, a bastion of pre-war knowledge and martial power, whose very existence inspired both awe and suspicion among the fractured settlements of California. For to the scattered wastelanders, the sight of armored knights patrolling the desert in T-51B suits, or wielding plasma rifles, seemed less like the remnants of the old world than the arrival of gods clad in steel, and yet beneath this aura of invincibility lay a very deliberate process of consolidation, one shaped by the successors of Roger Maxson, who worked tirelessly to preserve his legacy while adapting it to the shifting realities of the post-nuclear world. In the years after Maxson's death, his successors maintained the dynasty of leadership that elevated the Maxson line into a mythic institution, and under their stewardship, the Brotherhood began to expand beyond mere survival into dominance, establishing patrols across the wasteland to recover lost technology, striking against raider tribes and hostile mutants, and bringing back to Lost Hills troves of pre-war relics that were catalogued, studied, and often locked away, not for the benefit of the wider wasteland, but for the preservation of the Brotherhood's mission. This practice, which outsiders saw as hoarding, was from the Brotherhood's perspective a sacred duty, for they believed that every laser rifle, every circuit board, and every power cell was not only irreplaceable, but potentially catastrophic if allowed to fall into the hands of those who lacked the discipline and wisdom to wield it responsibly. And thus their expansion into California was not motivated by conquest in the traditional sense, but by preservation. Their campaigns focused less on territory and more on artifacts, less on subjects and more on stockpiles, so that they became in effect the self-proclaimed custodians of humanity's technological legacy, standing apart from the settlements and tribes that struggled to rebuild society on simpler means. The power of the Brotherhood was most evident in their monopoly over power armor, for while scattered remnants of military equipment existed in the ruins of the old world, no other faction possessed either the numbers of suits or the knowledge to maintain them. And thus the Brotherhood knights who strode into battle, clad in T-51B armor, became living symbols of invulnerability, able to withstand volleys of small arms fire that would shred ordinary men, able to wield heavy weapons with ease, and able to project authority in a wasteland where most survivors lived with crude firearms and improvised melee weapons. The sight of a Brotherhood patrol emerging from the dust, armor gleaming in the sun, became a reminder to the scattered settlements that there existed a force beyond raiders and traders, a disciplined order with both the will and the means to enforce its doctrine. And though the Brotherhood rarely sought to dominate entire populations, their mere presence cast a shadow across California, their authority respected even when resented, their strength unquestioned even when feared. At the same time, the Brotherhood's growing reputation was shaped not only by their martial dominance, but by their strict isolationism, for they did not seek to integrate with the wasteland settlements, nor to rebuild civilization in the manner of later powers like the new California Republic, and this deliberate detachment fueled the perception that they were both saviors and tyrants, protectors and hoarders, guardians and obstacles. For while they defended themselves against raiders and supermutants, they did not share their technological bounty with struggling communities, and while they offered stability within their own walls, they did not extend that stability outward into the broader wasteland. To many, this isolation made them appear aloof, even arrogant, an order that looked down upon the common people while claiming to safeguard humanity's future. And though their reasons were rooted in genuine conviction that technology in the hands of the unworthy would doom mankind anew, their refusal to share made them as feared as they were respected, a duality that would define their reputation across the West for centuries. During this period of ascendancy, the Brotherhood also refined its structure, solidifying the knightly hierarchy that would remain central to its identity, with initiates undergoing rigorous training to earn their place as squires and eventually knights, entrusted with the sacred charge of donning power armor and wielding advanced weaponry, while scribes devoted themselves to the study, repair, and documentation of recovered technology. Ensuring that every artifact was preserved and understood, the scribes, though less celebrated than the knights, became essential to the Brotherhood's survival, their tireless labor maintaining the machines that sustained the order, while the paladins, the elite warriors of the Brotherhood, led expeditions into the wasteland to retrieve technology and enforce the Brotherhood's will. Above them, the Council of Elders, anchored by the Maxson line, guided the order with a mixture of martial authority and ideological conviction, their decisions shaping not only the Brotherhood's actions but the philosophy that underpinned them. And, in this way, the Brotherhood developed into a society with distinct castes, each bound by duty to the preservation of knowledge and the defense of their people, yet unified by a shared reverence for the sacred mission entrusted to them by Roger Maxson. The Brotherhood's campaigns against hostile threats in California further solidified their dominance, for as the wasteland began to produce new dangers in the form of mutated creatures, raider warlords, and other groups vying for survival, the Brotherhood's mastery of advanced weaponry allowed them to defeat enemies that would have overwhelmed ordinary settlements. Super mutants, the grotesque products of the very FEV research that had birthed the Brotherhood at Mariposa, began to appear in increasing numbers, posing existential threats to human communities. Yet the Brotherhood, equipped with energy weapons and clad in power armor, proved capable of holding them at bay, striking against mutant strongholds and capturing samples for study. Their battles against these abominations, further reinforcing their self-image as humanity's guardians, chosen to stand between civilization and annihilation. Yet even in these victories, the Brotherhood's refusal to share their technology with others created tensions, for while they destroyed threats, they did not empower communities to defend themselves, preferring instead to remain the singular bulwark, a stance that ensured their indispensability but also deepened their isolation. This period also saw the Brotherhood's gradual spread across California, with patrols extending into the Central Valley, the ruins of Los Angeles, and the deserts of Nevada, each mission bringing back both relics and intelligence. And in time, smaller outposts were established, though always subordinate to Lost Hills, which remained the heart of the Order. These outposts allowed the Brotherhood to project power across vast distances, but they also stretched their resources thin. And as the years passed, the strain of maintaining dominance in a vast and hostile wasteland would begin to reveal the limits of their model. For unlike the NCR, that would later emerge with ambitions of governance and expansion, the Brotherhood had no interest in building a civilian state or fostering broad alliances, and thus their influence, though formidable, remained rooted in fear, respect, and technological superiority, rather than in lasting political institutions. By the dawn of the 22nd century, the Brotherhood of Steel had achieved a stature unparalleled in the post-war West, their knights walking the land as living symbols of the old world's might, their scribes preserving knowledge thought lost to nuclear fire, and their elders guiding them with the conviction that they alone could prevent the repetition of mankind's greatest mistakes. Yet this very isolation, this refusal to integrate with the broader wasteland, carried within it the seeds of stagnation. For while their power was undeniable, their influence was limited by their unwillingness to share, and their belief in their own superiority ensured that they remained apart, guardians of humanity in theory, but removed from humanity in practice. Still, in this period of ascendancy, the Brotherhood represented the pinnacle of what survivors could achieve in the ruins of the old world, a disciplined and powerful order whose legacy would shape not only California, but the entire history of the wasteland in the centuries to come. The Brotherhood of Steel's ascendancy in California inevitably gave way to a long era of isolationism and stagnation, a period in which their power, though still formidable, began to calcify under the weight of their own dogma, their insularity, and their refusal to adapt to the changing realities of the post-war West. For though they stood unmatched in technology and martial prowess, they increasingly withdrew into the safety of their bunkers, turning their gaze inward while the wider wasteland struggled toward fragile forms of civilization, a divergence that would, over time, diminish the relevance of the order in a land no longer defined solely by survival against raiders and mutants, but by the emerging potential of organized societies. The roots of this stagnation lay in the Brotherhood's very philosophy, for while their mission to preserve technology had served them well in the chaos of the immediate post-war centuries, it also bound them to a narrow worldview in which technology was hoarded, locked away, and guarded with zealous fervor rather than disseminated to rebuild civilization. And this refusal to share, once justified by the dangers of misuse, increasingly appeared not as wisdom, but as arrogance to those beyond their walls. Within the Lost Hills bunker, the Brotherhood's hierarchy hardened, the Council of Elders and the Maxson dynasty enforcing a rigid interpretation of Roger Maxson's vision, one that placed the safeguarding of technology above all other concerns, even when doing so meant ignoring the struggles of wasteland settlements that sought to rebuild. And while patrols continued to scour ruins for artifacts, the Brotherhood's interactions with outsiders became ever more limited, focused not on alliances or assistance, but on enforcing the Order's authority over technology, often through intimidation or outright confiscation, a practice that alienated them from potential allies and left them increasingly isolated. Scribes catalogued new discoveries, but their work remained cloistered, inaccessible to anyone beyond the Order, while knights trained for missions that rarely extended beyond retrieval operations or defensive patrols, and though the Brotherhood remained formidable, they began to project less influence in the day-to-day lives of the Wasteland's people, their very power creating a distance that gradually eroded their relevance. This growing detachment coincided with the emergence of new powers in California, most notably the fledgling New California Republic, a federation of settlements that arose from shady sands under the leadership of Aradesh and later Tandy. And unlike the Brotherhood, the NCR embraced expansion, democracy, trade, and cooperation, offering a vision of unity that contrasted starkly with the Brotherhood's insularity. As the NCR expanded across California, establishing law, trade routes, and political structures, the Brotherhood watched warily from behind their bunkers, unwilling to cooperate, yet unwilling to fully oppose. And in this uneasy coexistence, the first cracks in the Brotherhood's supremacy became apparent, for while they remained unmatched in military technology, they lacked the manpower, infrastructure, and political will to control territory on the scale of the NCR, and so their influence, once unquestioned, began to appear less absolute, their authority increasingly confined to their own strongholds, rather than spread across the wasteland. Compounding this stagnation was the Brotherhood's inward focus. For generations of elders, scribes, and knights became consumed by the preservation of their traditions, their rituals, and their hierarchy, often at the expense of innovation or adaptation. And while they preserved advanced weapons and armor, they contributed little to the rebuilding of human civilization, their hoarded knowledge serving only themselves, their rituals of induction, their rites of passage, their carefully maintained hierarchies, ensured continuity but also rigidity, leaving little room for change. And though they saw themselves as humanity's guardians, their refusal to engage with the broader needs of the wasteland created a widening gulf between their ideals and their reality. For while they preserved the machines of the past, they allowed the potential for a cooperative future to pass them by, cementing their identity as an insular order of warrior monks rather than as leaders of a reborn society. Even militarily, the Brotherhood's strength began to wane relative to the growing powers of the wasteland. For while they retained unmatched access to energy weapons and power armor, their numbers were always limited, and as they withdrew into their bunkers and restricted recruitment to strict, selective standards, their capacity to project power diminished, leaving them increasingly reliant on fear and reputation rather than on active dominance. Raids against mutants and scavenging missions continued, but large-scale campaigns became rare, and while they were still feared by raiders and respected by travelers, their relevance was no longer universal, for the NCR and other factions began to establish their own defenses, their own industries, and their own means of survival, reducing the Brotherhood's role from central power to isolated custodian, still formidable, but no longer indispensable. This isolationism also sowed seeds of internal discord, for not all within the Brotherhood agreed with the strict adherence to tradition, and tensions emerged between those who wished to engage more openly with the wasteland and those who insisted on maintaining the old ways, divisions that would in time contribute to splinter groups, outcasts, and alternative chapters such as the Midwest Brotherhood. These early debates, though often contained within the councils of elders, reflected the growing recognition that the Brotherhood's refusal to adapt was leading to stagnation. And while traditionalists argued that survival required purity of purpose, reformists warned that without adaptation, the Brotherhood risked irrelevance, a prophecy that would prove true, as their isolation left them sidelined in the political evolution of California. The paradox of this era was that while the Brotherhood continued to expand its knowledge and hoard technology, they contributed little to progress in the wasteland, so that their mission, conceived as a safeguard for humanity, became in practice a barrier to its advancement. And while their scribes painstakingly catalogued pre-war schematics, while their knights patrolled in power armor, while their elders intoned the lessons of Roger Maxson, the world outside grew without them, settlements organizing, economies emerging, and political entities taking shape, all without the Brotherhood's participation. Their very insularity, once a strength that preserved their mission through the chaos of the post-war years, became a weakness in an age of rebuilding, for they clung to the past while others forged the future, and in doing so, they ensured that their dominance would erode, their stagnation, a self-inflicted wound, born of an inability to adapt to the changing times. Thus, the era of isolationism and stagnation was both a testament to the Brotherhood's resilience and a harbinger of their decline. For while they survived when so many other groups perished, their survival came at the cost of relevance. And while they preserved the technology of the past, they failed to shape the future, their power becoming a relic of an earlier age, rather than a force of leadership in the new one. And so, as the new California Republic rose to prominence, as the wasteland began to take its first steps towards civilization, the Brotherhood remained ensconced in their bunkers, proud, disciplined, and unyielding, yet increasingly sidelined, their stagnation setting the stage for the conflicts, schisms, and transformations that would define their story in the centuries to come. The Brotherhood of Steel's role in the events surrounding the Vault Dweller and the fall of the Master's army was the first time the Order revealed itself to the wider wasteland in a direct and unmistakable fashion, a moment that demonstrated both the extent of their power and the limits of their philosophy. For while they had remained cloistered within the Lost Hills bunker through years of isolationism, watching as settlements rose and fell, raider bands pillaged, and mutants spread, the crisis of the late 160 forced them into an uneasy engagement with the outside world, and in doing so, they cemented their image as both aloof guardians and reluctant allies, a paradox that defined their role in Fallout's earliest history. When the Vault Dweller first encountered the Brotherhood, it was not through an invitation, but through the imposing sight of the heavily fortified gates of Lost Hills, where power-armored knights stood as silent sentinels, and the Order's policy of exclusion barred entry to all outsiders. For the Brotherhood still regarded the wasteland with suspicion, and it was only through the Vault Dweller's perseverance and demonstration of worth that the gates were opened, allowing one of the rare outsiders of the age to step inside the heart of the Order. Within Lost Hills, the Vault Dweller found a society unlike any other in the wasteland, a rigid hierarchy of elders, paladins, knights, and scribes, their lives bound by oaths and rituals that blended the discipline of a military order with the austerity of a monastic brotherhood, a society where advanced technology was both weapon and scripture, studied, preserved, and revered, and where the walls themselves hummed with the quiet power of functioning reactors and pre-war systems that few beyond those walls could imagine still existed. The elders, cautious but pragmatic, saw in the Vault Dweller an opportunity, for while they did not extend trust easily, they recognized that the outsider had the potential to serve as an instrument in their larger mission, and so they tested the Vault Dweller's loyalty and ability, sending them into the wasteland on a dangerous mission to the Glow, the irradiated ruins of the West-Tek research facility, a site that embodied both the horrors and the treasures of pre-war technology. The Glow proved to be a crucible, for within its collapsed laboratories and lethal radiation, the Vault Dweller encountered both the price of mankind's hubris and the promise of its forgotten innovations, recovering vital data for the Brotherhood while narrowly surviving the hostile environment. And in doing so, the outsider earned the Brotherhood's respect, proving themselves capable of walking among knights and scribes. This trial opened the path to cooperation, and the Brotherhood, who had long denied the wasteland access to their might, began to consider the Vault Dweller a useful ally, someone who might assist in their struggle against the growing threat of the Master and his army of super mutants, a menace that endangered not only settlements but humanity itself, for the forced evolutionary virus had created beings stronger, more resilient, and potentially more numerous than ordinary humans, and the Brotherhood recognized that unchecked, the Master's vision of a unity could overwhelm the fragile remnants of civilization. Yet even in the face of this existential threat, the Brotherhood's cooperation was marked by hesitation and self-interest, for their initial stance toward the mutant menace was cautious, skeptical, and even dismissive, with many elders unwilling to commit their knights to a war that did not directly threaten Lost Hills. And it was only through the Vault Dwellers' persistence, as well as evidence gathered during the campaign, that the Brotherhood was ultimately persuaded to act. Once committed, however, the Brotherhood demonstrated why they were the most formidable military force in the Wasteland, for their knights, clad in T-51B armor and armed with plasma rifles and heavy weaponry, were capable of slaughtering super mutants in battle, where ordinary fighters would have been annihilated, and their participation in the war against the Master proved decisive. Their advanced technology and disciplined ranks tipping the balance in humanity's favor during the climactic battles. The fall of the Master in 2162, brought about by the Vault Dwellers' intervention, and the combined resistance of Wasteland forces, was also a moment of reckoning for the Brotherhood, for though they had survived untouched for decades, it was only through cooperation with an outsider and reluctant engagement with the wider world that they had played their role in defeating the greatest threat of the age, and this paradox revealed the tension at the heart of the Brotherhood's philosophy. Their belief in isolation and technological preservation had kept them strong, but it was their willingness, however limited, to work with the Vault Dweller and share their might that ensured humanity's survival, a contradiction that would haunt their identity in the centuries to come. Despite this pivotal role, the Brotherhood did not emerge from Fallout 1 as a triumphant savior in the eyes of the Wasteland, but rather as a shadowy, enigmatic force whose involvement was known to few, for while the Vault Dwellers' legend spread, the Brotherhood returned to their bunkers, retreating into secrecy once more, unwilling to embrace a larger role in the political or social rebuilding of the Wasteland. To them, the defeat of the Master was less a call to expansion than a reaffirmation of their mission, proof that they were correct to preserve their strength until it was absolutely necessary, proof that humanity's survival depended on their guardianship, and so they resumed their isolation, content to let the Vault Dweller bear the mantle of legend, while they remained behind the walls of Lost Hills, their myth growing in whispers rather than proclamations. Yet this retreat also underscored the limitations of their worldview, for while they had been instrumental in defeating the super mutant threat, they had done little to strengthen humanity beyond their own order, and in the years following the Master's defeat, as settlements recovered and began to grow, the Brotherhood remained aloof, absent from the processes of reconstruction, and content to wait for the next crisis, rather than shaping the Wasteland into something greater. Their role in Fallout 1 thus stands as both their moment of glory and the beginning of their decline, for though they proved themselves unmatched on the battlefield, their refusal to adapt or expand ensured that their influence, while immense in the short term, would gradually diminish as the world beyond them began to rebuild without their guidance. In the end, the Brotherhood's part in Fallout 1 is remembered less as the dawn of a new era for the Order than as a snapshot of their nature, powerful yet insular, willing to act only when forced, and ultimately defined not by their contributions to civilization, but by their devotion to their own insular mission, a paradox that would shape their legacy for centuries. For while the Vault Dweller became a hero of the Wasteland, the Brotherhood of Steel remained what they had always been, custodians of steel, watchers from the shadows, indispensable in crisis but absent in peace, a power that existed alongside humanity rather than as part of it, a contradiction that ensured their continued relevance even as it. By the time the events of Fallout 2 unfolded in the late 2240 seconds, The Brotherhood of Steel in California had entered a period of marked decline, a fading power no longer the undisputed force of the wasteland, but rather a shadow of its former glory, reduced in visibility, ambition, and relevance as new powers emerged to fill the vacuum they had left through decades of isolationism, most notably the new California Republic, which had grown from the humble beginnings of Shady Sands into a sprawling and ambitious federation of settlements stretching across the core of California. The Brotherhood, once feared as invincible knights, clad in steel, had become increasingly insular, their numbers dwindling and their influence receding, so that when the Chosen One, descendant of the Vault Dweller, encountered them, the Order was no longer a looming titan on the landscape, but a diminished organization clinging to scattered outposts. Their role in the broader affairs of the wasteland largely peripheral, their legacy sustained more by memory and myth than by actual power. The most striking evidence of this decline was the presence of only a handful of Brotherhood outposts scattered across California, each manned by small contingents of knights and scribes, and while these outposts still maintained power armor and advanced weaponry, their mission had narrowed to observation, reconnaissance, and the occasional reclamation of lost technology rather than the sweeping campaigns of earlier centuries. Their numbers were insufficient to challenge the NCR's expanding military, nor did they attempt to intervene in the escalating tensions between the Republic and other powers, such as the Enclave or the tribes of the North, instead content to watch, record, and occasionally provide discreet assistance to individuals deemed worthy of trust, a stance that reinforced the perception of the Brotherhood as aloof relics of an earlier age, rather than active players in the new order emerging across California. One of the key figures encountered by the Chosen One during this era was senior paladin John Cassidy, and himself a veteran of the Brotherhood's traditions, who had grown disillusioned with the Order's inward-looking policies and had left to make his way in the wasteland, eventually becoming a companion and mentor figure to the Chosen One, his very presence outside the Order symbolic of the Brotherhood's struggles to retain its relevance. For if even loyal knights found greater purpose in the wider world than within the bunkers, it revealed the degree to which the Order's stagnation had eroded its sense of mission. Cassidy's knowledge of the Brotherhood and his pragmatism served as a living reminder of what the Order had once stood for. Even as the Brotherhood itself receded into obscurity, reduced to offering limited support to the Chosen One in the form of equipment or information, but unwilling to mobilize in force against the dangers that threatened California. The Brotherhood's diminished stature was further highlighted in their relationship with the Enclave, the shadowy remnant of the pre-war United States government that emerged during Fallout 2 as a direct and existential threat to humanity, possessing both advanced technology and genocidal ambitions to exterminate all non-Enclave humans through the use of the modified forced evolutionary virus. While the Brotherhood was aware of the Enclave and concerned by their activities, their limited numbers and isolationist policies prevented them from mounting any meaningful opposition, leaving the burden of confronting the Enclave to the Chosen One and their allies, and this absence from the decisive conflict of the age underscored the Brotherhood's decline, for where once they had stood as the indispensable bulwark against threats like the Master, now they played, at best, a minor supporting role, their contributions overshadowed by the actions of wastelanders who had no access to their hidden bunkers or sacred oaths. This marginalization did not mean the Brotherhood was irrelevant, for to those who encountered them, their presence remained awe-inspiring, their power armor still unmatched, their knowledge still coveted, and their authority still formidable when invoked, but their reluctance to act, their refusal to engage in the messy politics of the NCR, and their narrow focus on hoarding technology ensured that they were increasingly sidelined in the grand narrative of California's rebuilding. Their once mighty influence diminished to whispers and legends of knights in steel who guarded treasures but offered little to the people struggling to rebuild their world. Their legacy endured, but their relevance waned. And this paradox defined their role in Fallout 2, for they were at once reminders of the wasteland's violent past and relics fading before the march of history, powerful yet peripheral, respected yet irrelevant. At the same time, the Brotherhood's encounter with the Chosen One reaffirmed the continuing importance of individuals in their philosophy. For though they remained distrustful of outsiders, they recognized in the descendant of the Vault Dweller a figure worthy of engagement, and they extended limited trust and resources to aid in the Chosen One's mission, not out of altruism, but out of recognition that the preservation of humanity depended on ensuring that figures of destiny could succeed where the Brotherhood itself could not. This pragmatic engagement revealed both the limits of their capacity and the persistence of their ideology, for they remained convinced that technology must not fall into unworthy hands, but they also acknowledged, however reluctantly, that their dwindling numbers forced them to rely on outsiders to carry out tasks once reserved for their own knights, a concession that revealed just how far they had fallen from their days of unquestioned supremacy. The Brotherhood's decline during Fallout 2 can thus be seen as the inevitable outcome of decades of isolationism and stagnation, the natural consequence of their refusal to adapt to a changing world. For while the NCR grew into a political and military power capable of shaping California's future, the Brotherhood remained cloistered, their strength preserved but unused, their mission unchanged, but increasingly irrelevant. They had survived the Master, but in doing so, they had trapped themselves in a vision of the past, unable or unwilling to evolve, and thus they became spectators in the rise of the Republic, their role reduced to a handful of outposts, a scattering of veterans, and occasional acts of reluctant support. And yet, even in decline, the Brotherhood of Steel remained a symbol, a name spoken with a mixture of reverence and suspicion across California. For though their numbers were small, their myth loomed large, their steel-clad knights and hidden bunkers, capturing the imagination of wastelanders who dreamed of lost technologies and whispered of guardians who watched from the shadows. Their irrelevance in practice did not erase their presence in memory, and in this way, they persisted, not as the dominant force they once were, but as an enduring legend, a reminder of the days when Knights of Steel had walked the land as protectors and hoarders alike, shaping the destiny of humanity even as they withdrew from its day-to-day struggles. Thus, the Brotherhood in Fallout 2 embodies the paradox of their history, diminished yet enduring, sidelined yet remembered, a relic of the past that refused to fade entirely. For while the NCR marched forward, and the Chosen One faced down the Enclave, the Brotherhood remained in their bunkers, watching, waiting, convinced that their mission still mattered even as history passed them by, their stagnation now complete, their decline undeniable, yet their legacy still potent enough to ensure that their story was not yet finished, for even in the shadows, the Brotherhood of Steel remained part of the fabric of the wasteland, waiting for the day when their steel would once again shape the destiny of the world. The centuries following the rise, stagnation, and decline of the Brotherhood of Steel in California were marked by internal tension and ideological fractures that would give rise to the first significant schisms within the Order a phenomenon rooted in the inherent contradictions of their mission, the pressures of isolationism, and the evolving landscape of the post-nuclear wasteland. For while the original doctrine established by Roger Maxson emphasized the preservation of technology and the moral imperative of restraint, subsequent generations struggled to reconcile this rigid philosophy with the practical challenges of survival, recruitment, and interaction with an increasingly populated world, leading to disagreements over the proper balance between guardianship and engagement, secrecy and outreach, intervention and abstention, and these disputes ultimately resulted in the formation of splinter groups and offshoot chapters, each claiming fidelity to Maxson's vision while interpreting it through their own lens, reflecting the tensions inherent in any organization devoted to safeguarding knowledge while facing a dynamic and dangerous environment. One of the earliest and most significant schisms emerged in the mid-22 ND century, when disagreements over the Brotherhood's engagement with the NCR became irreconcilable, particularly among knights and elders stationed at the periphery of California, who observed the Republic's expansion and influence, and debated whether the Order should actively participate in shaping the emerging political landscape or continue its insular policies. Traditionalists argued that direct involvement risked contamination, both moral and practical, asserting that contact with outsiders would erode discipline, compromise the stewardship of technology, and draw the Brotherhood into conflicts unrelated to their core mission. While pragmatists, influenced by the example of the Vault Dweller and the Chosen One, contended that selective cooperation and engagement could extend the Brotherhood's influence, prevent the misuse of technology, and ensure the survival of human civilization beyond the walls of Lost Hills. And these debates, though initially managed through council deliberations, eventually produced irreconcilable differences that led to the creation of autonomous splinter groups. Among the most notable offshoots was the Northern California Brotherhood, sometimes referred to as the Outcasts, who rejected the centralization and secrecy of the Lost Hills leadership, advocating instead for a more flexible approach that allowed engagement with wasteland communities while still preserving critical technology, and who maintained that strict adherence to Maxson's original doctrine had become counterproductive, a formula for irrelevance. In a world that had evolved beyond their bunkers, the Outcasts retained the trappings of Brotherhood identity, power armor, ranks, and training, but reinterpreted the Order's mission to include the active use of technology for the protection and improvement of human settlements, a radical departure from the conservative stewardship of Lost Hills, and in doing so, they both preserved and subverted the legacy of the Maxson line, demonstrating that fidelity to doctrine could exist alongside adaptation, a principle that the Central Brotherhood would resist for decades. Conversely, other schisms were fueled by internal power struggles and personal ambition, for the hierarchical and dynastic nature of the Brotherhood sometimes exacerbated tensions between elders, knights, and paladins, particularly when access to power armor and advanced weaponry became a means of asserting authority beyond moral or ideological justification. These rivalries occasionally erupted into open conflict, with outlying chapters asserting autonomy and even defying orders from Lost Hills. And while such disputes were often contained through negotiation, the ideological and practical implications were profound, as they revealed that the Brotherhood's rigid structure, designed to ensure discipline and survival, could also generate centrifugal forces that pulled the organization apart, undermining unity while highlighting the necessity of leadership capable of balancing authority with adaptability. The schisms of this period were not confined to California. For as the Brotherhood expanded into other regions of the wasteland, including the Mojave and the Midwest, differing environmental conditions, threats, and local circumstances prompted divergent interpretations of Maxson's doctrine, and these regional variations produced chapters that were increasingly independent in practice, with some adhering closely to isolationist and secretive principles, while others embraced pragmatic engagement with settlements, alliances, and even commerce. The result was a complex mosaic of Brotherhood identities, unified in name but fractured in function, with each chapter developing its own traditions, rituals, and enforcement practices, and while they remained bound by the symbolic authority of the Maxson line, the practical effect was a decentralized network of orders that could no longer claim the unchallenged supremacy or cohesion of the original California Brotherhood. These schisms also had ideological dimensions beyond mere strategy or practical engagement, for debates over the ethical use of technology, the treatment of wastelanders, and the definition of worthy hands for pre-war artifacts became increasingly contentious. While some chapters argued for strict, even draconian enforcement, emphasizing moral purity, control, and the elimination of perceived threats, others contended that a broader, more humanitarian approach could advance Maxson's vision by protecting more people and ensuring that humanity benefited from preserved technology, and these conflicts often led to long-standing feuds, covert sabotage, and even violent confrontations between splinter groups, each convinced of the righteousness of its interpretation of the Order's sacred mission, a reflection of the tensions inherent in any organization tasked with guarding power while remaining morally accountable. Perhaps the most famous schism in later generations emerged from the Midwestern Brotherhood, which relocated from California to the heart of the wasteland around the late 22nd century, and which became known for its radical isolation and rigidity, rejecting the more flexible interpretations of splinter groups while maintaining an almost fanatical adherence to the preservationist doctrine, a stance that eventually brought it into conflict with both local communities and other Brotherhood chapters. This chapter exemplified the long-term consequences of the schismatic process, for while it claimed fidelity to the original mission, its rigid enforcement, militarism, and refusal to adapt alienated potential allies and limited its operational effectiveness, illustrating the paradox that strict adherence to ideology could simultaneously sustain identity while undermining practical relevance in a changing world. Throughout these centuries, the phenomenon of schism also highlighted a broader philosophical question at the heart of the Brotherhood's existence. Could an organization founded on rigid principles, steeped in ritual, and isolated from the broader currents of human society, remain viable in a world that demanded adaptation, negotiation, and engagement? The answer, as the history of these internal fractures demonstrates, was both yes and no. Yes, because the Brotherhood's core mission, identity, and power remained intact even in fractured form, and no, because the fragmentation diluted their authority, limited their influence, and exposed the vulnerabilities inherent in a rigid hierarchical system dependent on a singular, unchanging vision. In conclusion, the Brotherhood's schisms were more than mere disputes over policy or leadership. They represented the collision between tradition and adaptation, between ideology and survival, between the sacred mandate to preserve technology and the practical needs of a dynamic wasteland. And while these fractures created tension, inefficiency, and occasional conflict, they also ensured the persistence of the Brotherhood's identity across multiple generations. For even splinter groups, whether isolationist or pragmatic, carried forward the core tenets of Maxson's vision, demonstrating that while unity might be lost, the mission endured. A paradox that would shape the Order's trajectory well into the 23rd and 24th centuries, and ultimately set the stage for the later reforms and reunifications that would come under the stewardship of descendants of the original Maxson line, whose leadership would attempt to reconcile the Order's fractured past with the exigencies of a wasteland increasingly defined by political complexity, technological scarcity, and moral ambiguity. The arrival of the Brotherhood of Steel in the capital wasteland, centuries after the founding of the Order in California, represented a pivotal evolution in both the organization's structure and its strategic philosophy, as the remnants of the Order, long isolated in the West, were rediscovered in the ruins of Washington, D.C., by agents and scholars tracing pre-war technology, and quickly established themselves as a dominant faction in the region, transplanting the core principles of Maxson's vision to a new environment, while adapting to the unique geopolitical, ecological, and social conditions of the mid-23 RD century eastern United States. The Brotherhood's establishment in the capital wasteland was not a simple act of colonization, but a carefully orchestrated movement of exiles and splinter groups who, following decades of isolation, migration, and conflict, had consolidated their forces around the remnants of pre-war military installations, including the massive underground bunkers of the Washington metropolitan area, and transformed these ruins into fortified outposts from which they could safeguard technology, enforce their ideology, and project power across the devastated region. This eastern incarnation of the Brotherhood, later known as the Capital Wasteland Brotherhood, retained the core hierarchical structure established in California, with elders providing strategic oversight, paladins and knights forming the primary combat cadre, and scribes tasked with the preservation, analysis, and repair of pre-war technology. Yet it also reflected the adaptive strategies necessitated by its new environment, for the capital wasteland presented a far denser and more complex collection of human settlements than the scattered desert communities of California, including nascent cities, organized factions, and the looming presence of the Enclave, whose ambitions threatened human survival and elevated the strategic importance of the Brotherhood's mission from mere preservation to active engagement, a development that would fundamentally challenge the Order's long-standing isolationist tendencies and force a reconsideration of doctrine developed centuries earlier under the watchful eye of Roger Maxson. The Brotherhood's approach in the capital wasteland was simultaneously pragmatic and ideologically rigid, as they recognized the necessity of controlling strategic assets, such as pre-war military bunkers, intact supply caches, and nuclear technology, while also insisting upon strict oversight of the use and distribution of any recovered devices, a stance that frequently put them at odds with local populations, scavenger groups, and emerging power structures, particularly the fledgling settlements of Megaton and Tenpenny Tower. These conflicts highlighted the enduring tension at the heart of the Brotherhood's philosophy, for while they justified their actions under the imperative of safeguarding technology from misuse, their rigid enforcement often manifested as coercion, intimidation, and moral absolutism, reinforcing their reputation as both protectors of humanity and aloof enforcers, whose conception of worthy hands extended only to those willing to submit to the Order's authority and its strict ethical and operational codes. The arrival of the Brotherhood in the capital wasteland also coincided with the rise of the Enclave as a central threat to humanity, a development that dramatically reshaped the Order's operational priorities, For the Enclave's control over advanced pre-war technology, its ability to project military force, and its genocidal plans represented an existential challenge to which the isolated, doctrine-bound Western Brotherhood would have been ill-equipped to respond without strategic adaptation, and thus, the Eastern Brotherhood evolved in a manner that blended preservation with militarized engagement, balancing its ideological purity with the practical necessity of fielding effective combat operations against an organized and technologically sophisticated adversary. This adaptation included the recruitment and training of additional knights, the development of mobile strike teams capable of rapid response, and the establishment of secure facilities for the study and deployment of captured or recovered pre-war devices, a strategy that transformed the Eastern Brotherhood into a far more interventionist organization than its California predecessor. The leadership of Elder Owen Lyons, though brief and primarily transitional, marked the beginning of a critical shift in the capital wasteland, as Lyons emphasized both the expansion of Brotherhood influence and the ethical imperative of protecting innocent lives from threats such as raiders, supermutants, and mutant abominations. Under Lyons, the Brotherhood extended its operational footprint, established supply and intelligence networks, and began to intervene more actively in regional conflicts, signaling a departure from centuries of strict isolationism and reinforcing the notion that the Order's survival depended not only upon hoarding technology, but also upon judicious action in the wider human landscape. This philosophy laid the groundwork for the later reforms of Elder Arthur Maxson, whose eventual leadership would codify these principles into a coherent doctrine that integrated discipline, preservation, and proactive engagement. The Eastern Brotherhood's relationship with the supermutant threat, particularly the supermutants of Volt 87 and the widespread FEV contamination, was one of both necessity and moral calculation, as the Order recognized that unchecked mutant populations could destabilize the fragile societies emerging in the capital wasteland and threaten humanity's continued survival. Yet their approach remained methodical, relying on carefully planned expeditions, reconnaissance, and surgical strikes rather than indiscriminate violence, consistent with their broader doctrine that technology and power must be wielded with discipline and foresight. In this regard, the Capital Wasteland Brotherhood functioned as a moral and martial filter, determining which threats could be neutralized, which technology could be deployed, and which individuals or groups were worthy to inherit the tools of the old world, a philosophy that underscored the continuity of Maxson's original vision even in a radically different environmental and social context. The Brotherhood's intervention in the capital wasteland during the events surrounding the Lone Wanderer, the Volt 101 escapee, represented the first major operational test of the Order's adaptive philosophy in this region. As the Lone Wanderer's investigations into the Enclave, the supermutant menace, and the broader dynamics of the wasteland required the Brotherhood to balance its doctrinal imperatives with the practical realities of field support, intelligence gathering, and selective cooperation, while they remained cautious, providing equipment, guidance, and tactical intelligence to the Lone Wanderer. The Brotherhood exercised strict oversight over the use of technology, ensuring that pre-war assets did not fall into unworthy hands, and in doing so, they demonstrated both the enduring strength of their hierarchical organization and the strategic flexibility that had become necessary in a world where survival was inseparable from moral and practical judgment. Despite these adaptations, the Capital Wasteland Brotherhood retained many hallmarks of their historical identity, including the deeply ingrained sense of elitism, the ritualistic reverence for pre-war artifacts, and the strict code of conduct governing recruitment, training, and deployment. These elements served both to preserve organizational cohesion and to reinforce the mythology of the Order as a force, apart from the chaos of the wasteland. A reminder that even in a region far from California, the core values instilled by Roger Maxson continued to shape decisions, operations, and identity, ensuring continuity across centuries, regions, and generations. In sum, the Brotherhood of Steel, in the capital wasteland, represented the culmination of centuries of evolution, adaptation, and doctrinal persistence, blending the original preservationist ethos with operational pragmatism, military discipline with moral oversight, and hierarchical authority with strategic engagement. While still marked by elitism, isolationism in some respects, and moral absolutism, the Eastern Brotherhood demonstrated that survival in the post-nuclear world required both fidelity to ideology and flexibility in execution, setting the stage for the Order's later expansion, reunification efforts, and resurgence under the leadership of Elder Arthur Maxson, who would ultimately transform the Brotherhood into a coherent, continent-spanning force capable of shaping the destiny of the wasteland on a scale unmatched since the days of Lost Hills. The reunification of the Brotherhood of Steel, which began to take shape in the mid-23 RD century under the emerging leadership of Arthur Maxson, represented a watershed moment in the history of an organization long fractured by schisms, geographic separation, and ideological divergence, as centuries of isolationism, stagnation, and regional autonomy had produced a fragmented order whose chapters, while sharing a common ancestry and foundational doctrine, operated with varying degrees of independence and often conflicting interpretations of Maxson's original vision, and whose declining influence had rendered them peripheral in the political, social, and military dynamics of the post-war wasteland. The task of reunification was not merely administrative or symbolic, but profoundly strategic, requiring the consolidation of disparate chapters across the American continent, the reconciliation of ideological differences between traditionalists and pragmatists, the integration of both Western and Eastern factions, and the restoration of the Brotherhood's capacity to assert technological, military, and moral authority in a wasteland that had long moved forward in their absence, a process that demanded both vision and ruthlessness, charisma and discipline, and ultimately a leader capable of embodying the ideals of the Order while adapting them to contemporary exigencies. Arthur Maxson, a direct descendant of the original West Coast Maxson line, emerged as that leader, embodying a rare combination of martial skill, intellectual acumen, and doctrinal purity, and it was under his stewardship that the fragmented chapters of the Brotherhood were gradually brought under a single command, unified by both bloodline legitimacy and shared purpose. For Maxson's vision extended beyond the mere preservation of technology, to include the restoration of the Brotherhood as a dominant, continent-spanning power capable of enforcing discipline, protecting humanity, and controlling the use of pre-war relics in an increasingly complex and dangerous world. His efforts involved not only diplomatic engagement with hesitant chapter leaders, and the careful management of internal politics, but also the demonstration of martial prowess and organizational competence, for the reunification could not be achieved through ideology alone, and the display of strength, commitment, and a clear vision for the Order's future was essential to convince fractured factions that their survival and relevance depended upon cohesion under a centralized leadership. The process of reunification also required the reconciliation of deeply entrenched philosophical differences. For while some chapters, particularly the outcasts in the West, favored a more open approach to human societies and were skeptical of strict hierarchies and doctrinal rigidity, other chapters, such as the Midwestern Brotherhood, adhered to a purist and isolationist interpretation of Maxson's doctrine, emphasizing technological stewardship over engagement with the wider world. Maxson's strategy involved a careful balance of persuasion, demonstration of competence, and the judicious application of force, consolidating those willing to accept his authority while neutralizing or marginalizing factions that refused, a process that required both patience and ruthlessness, and which ultimately resulted in a more coherent organizational structure capable of centralized decision-making, rapid mobilization, and enforcement of both doctrinal and operational standards across all chapters. A critical element in the reunification was the integration of the Capital Wasteland Brotherhood, whose experience with engagement, militarized interventions, and interactions with emerging powers such as the Enclave provided both practical knowledge and ideological precedent for a unified order that could operate effectively across diverse and hostile regions. The lessons learned from field operations in the East, including the measured deployment of force, the ethical use of technology, and the cultivation of selective alliances, were codified under Maxson's leadership, informing the training of knights, the directives of paladins, and the priorities of scribes, ensuring that the unified brotherhood retained both the moral rigor and operational capability necessary to assert dominance while avoiding the pitfalls of past isolationism and stagnation. The reunification also entailed a significant logistical and organizational effort, for decades of autonomy had produced inconsistent practices, uneven resource distribution, and fragmented knowledge management across chapters, requiring Maxson and his senior staff to standardize training regimens, unify armories and equipment protocols, centralize intelligence gathering, and ensure that power armor, energy weapons, and pre-war artifacts were managed in accordance with uniform doctrine. This standardization not only enhanced operational efficiency, but also reinforced the symbolic authority of the central leadership, creating a coherent identity and chain of command that allowed the Brotherhood to function as a single, continent-spanning entity rather than as a loose confederation of semi-autonomous outposts, and thereby restored both internal cohesion and external credibility. In addition to structural and operational consolidation, reunification under Maxson was accompanied by a doctrinal recalibration, wherein the lessons of centuries of isolationism, stagnation, schism, and regional adaptation were synthesized into a cohesive philosophy that emphasized preservation of technology, disciplined martial readiness, and proactive engagement in the wider human world, with an understanding that the survival of humanity was inseparable from the Order's ability to shape the strategic and moral landscape of the wasteland. This new doctrine retained the sacred imperative to prevent pre-war technology from falling into unworthy hands, but tempered it with the recognition that selective cooperation, strategic intervention, and moral judgment were essential for the Order to remain relevant and effective in an increasingly populated and politically complex environment. The reunification process also required the cultivation of loyalty, morale, and a shared identity across generations of Brotherhood members who had grown up in fragmented chapters with diverse practices, and this was achieved through both ritual and demonstration, including formal oaths of allegiance, centralized training programs, public displays of technological and martial prowess, and the strategic placement of Maxson and his closest advisors as living embodiments of the Order's ideals, reinforcing the notion that the Maxson bloodline represented not only historical legitimacy, but the living authority necessary to unify the Brotherhood. These measures created a sense of shared purpose, identity, and destiny among knights, paladins, and scribes, fostering cohesion, discipline, and operational reliability that had been lacking in previous centuries of fragmentation. Finally, the reunification of the Brotherhood under Arthur Maxson had profound strategic implications for the wasteland as a whole, for the consolidation of the Order's power, knowledge, and moral authority transformed it from a collection of regional actors into a dominant continental force capable of projecting power, influencing political outcomes, and safeguarding the future of humanity on a scale unparalleled since the days of Lost Hills. This resurgence not only restored the Order's operational capacity, but also reasserted its ideological influence, demonstrating that the Brotherhood, when unified under a capable and visionary leader, could overcome the centuries of decline, stagnation, and schism that had threatened its relevance, and emerge once again as a central actor in the post-nuclear world, a testament to the enduring strength, adaptability, and vision embedded in the Maxson legacy and the institutional structures established by the original Order. Central to the identity, power, and enduring relevance of the Brotherhood of Steel has always been its unrivaled control of technology and its meticulously maintained armory, which together constitute not only the tangible tools of warfare, but also the symbolic embodiment of the Order's doctrine. For in the post-apocalyptic landscape of the wasteland, where knowledge is scarce and survival is uncertain, the possession, preservation, and judicious deployment of pre-war technology defines both authority and legitimacy, and the Brotherhood's insistence on strict control over these resources distinguishes it from all other factions. From its earliest days in California under Roger Maxson, the Order established an institutional framework in which the acquisition, cataloging, storage, and study of advanced technology became inseparable from its moral mission, creating a culture in which the hoarding of power was not simply tactical, but theological, with each artifact representing both a potential threat to humanity if misused, and a sacred trust to be defended at all costs. And this philosophy would shape every aspect of the Brotherhood's operations for centuries. At the core of the Brotherhood's technological dominance is its iconic suit of power armor, beginning with the T-45 and T-51 series, which provides unparalleled protection, mobility, and battlefield resilience, and which serves simultaneously as a symbol of authority, an instrument of intimidation, and a tangible manifestation of the Order's martial superiority. Power armor, maintained by specialized scribes and deployed by trained knights and paladins, represents the convergence of military science and ceremonial prestige, for the suits are not merely functional equipment, but also a visible marker of rank, accomplishment, and commitment to the Brotherhood's mission, with the gleaming steel, integrated systems, and kinetic amplification embodying the ideals of discipline, mastery, and stewardship that define the Order, and ensuring that any appearance of a fully armored knight instantly communicates both threat and legitimacy across the wasteland. Complementing the armor are the Brotherhood's extensive arsenals, which include energy weapons, firearms, explosives, and pre-war experimental technology that far surpasses the capabilities of ordinary wasteland combatants, for the Order maintains secure caches of laser rifles, plasma weapons, miniguns, missile launchers, and advanced grenades, all of which are catalogued, repaired, and distributed according to a strict hierarchy and only to personnel deemed competent, loyal, and worthy, and the combined effect of armor and firepower establishes the Brotherhood as a force that can project decisive military authority even when outnumbered, a capability that has been demonstrated repeatedly in campaigns against raiders, super mutants, the Enclave, and other threats to human survival, and which reinforces the Order's doctrine that technological mastery is inseparable from moral and martial responsibility. The acquisition of technology is itself a highly organized and ritualized endeavor, reflecting both the operational needs and the philosophical imperatives of the Order, for the Brotherhood deploys dedicated scavenging and reconnaissance missions into ruins, pre-war facilities, and irradiated zones in order to recover artifacts, schematics, and functional equipment, and these operations are guided by careful assessments of risk, utility, and ethical responsibility, ensuring that no piece of technology is obtained recklessly or entrusted to unqualified hands. Once recovered, items are catalogued by scribes, repaired or reverse engineered, and stored in secure bunkers, often in conditions designed to maximize longevity and minimize the risk of contamination or loss, and this meticulous process ensures that the Brotherhood remains the preeminent repository of pre-war knowledge, a position that grants it both strategic advantage and moral authority. For the Order defines its legitimacy in part through its stewardship of technology and its capacity to prevent catastrophic misuse. The integration of technology into the Brotherhood's training, operations, and strategic planning is another essential aspect of their effectiveness, as knights and paladins are instructed not only in martial tactics, but also in the repair, maintenance, and judicious application of advanced systems, creating a warrior class that is uniquely capable of leveraging technological superiority in combat, while adhering to the moral and doctrinal constraints that define the Order. This education extends beyond weapons and armor to include sensors, communications arrays, power generation, and automated defense systems, producing a core of soldiers who are both physically formidable and intellectually adept at exploiting the capabilities of pre-war engineering, a dual competency that ensures operational dominance and reinforces the Order's philosophical claim that mastery of technology is inseparable from the moral responsibility to safeguard it. Beyond the battlefield, the Brotherhood's technology serves as a tool for governance, deterrence, and psychological influence. For the mere presence of knights in power armor, patrolling wasteland settlements, or manning fortified outposts, conveys authority, enforces compliance, and communicates the Order's capacity for both protection and punishment, a subtle but pervasive form of strategic leverage that extends the Brotherhood's influence far beyond the literal range of its weapons, and this psychological dimension of technological superiority has been critical in maintaining cohesion, ensuring obedience within the Order, and deterring challenges from external factions, ranging from raider bands to emergent regional powers, who recognize that direct confrontation with a fully equipped and trained contingent of Brotherhood knights is both dangerous and potentially catastrophic. The armory also includes rare and highly specialized pre-war artifacts, from experimental energy weapons to prototype robotics, nuclear ordnance, and advanced medical devices, all of which are treated with a mixture of reverence, fear, and scholarly attention, and whose presence underscores the dual nature of the Brotherhood's mission, as both a martial order and a custodian of civilization's remnants. These items are not simply tools, but repositories of knowledge, and their study, preservation, and selective deployment form the backbone of the Order's capacity to assert both dominance and moral authority, as each recovered artifact represents both the potential to rebuild and the risk of annihilation should it fall into the wrong hands, and thus the stewardship of such technology is inseparable from the Brotherhood's ethical and operational identity. Finally, the technological and armorial superiority of the Brotherhood is inseparable from its ideological and ceremonial culture, for the Order's identity is constructed around the discipline, training, and ritualized reverence for pre-war systems, and this culture ensures continuity, cohesion, and a sense of purpose across generations, reinforcing the notion that technology is not merely a means to an end, but a sacred trust, a test of moral character, and the defining criterion by which worthiness is measured. Whether through the donning of power armor, the wielding of a plasma rifle, or the careful study of a recovered schematic, every interaction with technology reinforces the values of the Order, instills a sense of discipline and responsibility, and perpetuates the mythos of the Brotherhood as the guardians of humanity's future, a mission in which steel, circuitry, and moral rigor are inseparable and eternal. The relationship between the Brotherhood of Steel and the remnants of the Enclave represents one of the most consequential and enduring conflicts in post-apocalyptic history. For while the Brotherhood is defined by its mission to preserve and safeguard technology, the Enclave embodies the misuse of that technology for authoritarian and genocidal ends, creating an existential clash of ideologies, strategies, and moral imperatives that has shaped the course of human survival across decades. And this conflict is rooted in the fundamental divergence of purpose between the two organizations, with the Brotherhood asserting that technology must be protected, regulated, and selectively deployed to safeguard humanity, and the Enclave seeking to dominate, purify, and control human populations through the unrestrained application of pre-war science and weaponry. From the earliest encounters, this conflict has underscored the philosophical and operational boundaries of the Brotherhood, forcing it to reconcile its isolationist tendencies with the necessity of direct engagement in order to prevent catastrophic misuse of the technologies it guards. The first major confrontation between these two powers occurs during the events surrounding the capital wasteland in the late 23rd century, when the Enclave, operating from offshore facilities and remnant government bunkers, began implementing plans to sterilize or exterminate populations deemed unworthy, including survivors of Vault 87 and surrounding settlements, using a combination of advanced robotics, energy weapons, and the genetically engineered forced evolutionary virus, a tool of both biological and political coercion, and it is within this context that the Brotherhood, under Elder Lyon's leadership, was forced to abandon portions of its traditional isolationist doctrine and engage directly, providing support, intelligence, and manpower to prevent human annihilation and to recover critical technology that might otherwise have been used for genocide, illustrating the inherent tension between doctrinal restraint and pragmatic necessity that has defined the Brotherhood's engagement with the Enclave across generations. This confrontation highlighted the critical tactical and technological asymmetries between the two factions. For while the Enclave commanded formidable resources, including power armor variants, vertibirds, nuclear warheads, and experimental energy weapons, their strategic vision was uncompromising and often reckless, and it was the disciplined application of Brotherhood doctrine combined with superior knowledge of wasteland conditions and tactical restraint that allowed relatively small contingents of knights and paladins to neutralize Enclave operations, protect settlements, and limit civilian casualties, thereby demonstrating that the Brotherhood's strength lies not only in its equipment, but also in its hierarchical cohesion, training, and the moral framework guiding its use of force, which contrasts starkly with the Enclave's utilitarian and authoritarian approach to technological deployment. The ongoing rivalry between the two factions is as much ideological as it is military, for the Enclave represents the darkest potential of pre-war American technological and political authority, claiming the mantle of the United States and justifying the extermination or subjugation of the wasteland survivors in pursuit of their vision of a purified nation, whereas the Brotherhood asserts that while humans are imperfect, survival and progress require careful stewardship, ethical oversight, and selective engagement, and thus every encounter between the two factions becomes a contest of values as well as firepower, with each battle, raid, or sabotage mission symbolizing the broader struggle for the ethical and moral use of humanity's inherited technology, and reinforcing the narrative that control over advanced systems entails both power and responsibility. Fallout 2. The Enclave's genocidal ambitions reached a critical stage, with plans to deploy a modified FEV strain to annihilate or sterilize human populations across the western United States. And while the Brotherhood's presence was largely peripheral due to its ongoing struggles with internal schisms and regional limitations, their ideology and preparatory intelligence served as a moral and operational counterpoint to Enclave designs, influencing wasteland factions and individual heroes, including the Chosen One, to act against the Enclave and thereby extending the Brotherhood's impact indirectly, even when direct confrontation was not feasible, highlighting the enduring influence of doctrine and ideology in shaping outcomes in the post-apocalyptic landscape. By the time of the Capital Wasteland crises chronicled in Fallout 3, the conflict had escalated to direct military confrontation, with the Brotherhood, now more centralized and disciplined under the emerging Maxson line, confronting Enclave forces in a series of strategic operations aimed at preventing the completion of Project Purity, an Enclave initiative to control the region's water supply and impose lethal sterilization protocols, and these engagements demonstrated both the evolution and adaptation of the Brotherhood's doctrine for the order-deployed power-armored strike teams, energy weapon squads, and coordinated intelligence operations to undermine Enclave infrastructure, rescue captured civilians, and secure pre-war assets, reflecting a sophisticated understanding of both the technological and human dimensions of warfare, and illustrating that the Brotherhood's effectiveness is derived from the combination of discipline, hierarchical cohesion, and moral guidance, rather than from sheer firepower alone. The relationship between the two factions is also marked by a psychological and symbolic dimension. For the Enclave, as the self-proclaimed continuation of pre-war America, embodies the corruption of authority, the perversion of technological stewardship, and the lethal consequences of moral absolutism, whereas the Brotherhood presents itself as a guardian of both life and legacy, wielding advanced systems with restraint, ritual, and ethical deliberation, and the contrast between the two serves as a living lesson in the hazards of technological power, divorced from moral accountability, reinforcing the Brotherhood's claim to legitimacy and its continued relevance in a world where unchecked ambition and hubris threaten both civilization and survival. The conflict between the Brotherhood and the Enclave extends beyond the battlefield to include intelligence warfare, sabotage, and strategic denial, For the Order is as committed to preventing the Enclave from acquiring critical technology as it is to deploying its own, reflecting a sophisticated approach to force projection that prioritizes containment and ethical stewardship over indiscriminate destruction. And this philosophy has allowed the Brotherhood to shape regional outcomes, even when outnumbered or outgunned, leveraging superior knowledge, coordination, and moral clarity to achieve objectives that might otherwise be unattainable, and demonstrating that control over technology entails not just possession, but disciplined judgment and foresight. In sum, the Brotherhood's ongoing conflict with the Enclave exemplifies the Order's enduring mission and the practical, ethical, and philosophical dimensions of its authority, for the confrontation is simultaneously a test of martial skill, organizational discipline, doctrinal fidelity, and moral judgment, and it underscores the central tenet of the Brotherhood's identity, that technology, while immensely powerful, must never be divorced from responsibility, and that the guardianship of humanity requires both the capability to project force and the wisdom to deploy it judiciously, a principle that has defined every engagement with the Enclave and ensured that, despite centuries of isolation, fragmentation, and regional variation, the Brotherhood remains both relevant and indispensable in the ongoing struggle to preserve human civilization in the aftermath of nuclear catastrophe. The expansion of the Brotherhood of Steel beyond its original Californian heartland and the subsequent influence it exerted across the post-apocalyptic landscape represent a critical chapter in understanding the Order not merely as a military or technological entity, but as a socio-political force whose presence reshaped the dynamics of survival, governance, and power in the wasteland. For as splintered chapters began to migrate eastward, northward, and into contested territories in the decades following the fall of the Master and the rise of regional powers such as the New California Republic, the Capital Wasteland factions, and later the Midwest and Mojave contingents, the Brotherhood increasingly transitioned from a cloistered monastic order into a quasi-continental organization capable of asserting authority, influencing political outcomes, and shaping human civilization through both the application of force and the stewardship of pre-war technology, a transformation that reflected centuries of adaptation, consolidation, and doctrinal evolution, culminating in the reunification efforts under Arthur Maxson and the strategic deployment of chapters to key regions of the United States. The Order's expansion was facilitated by several interrelated factors, including the preservation of critical pre-war infrastructure, mastery of advanced technology, and the hierarchical discipline that enabled even small contingents to project power disproportionate to their numbers. For a handful of power-armored knights could dominate vast stretches of wasteland through both martial prowess and the psychological authority conferred by technological superiority, and this dual capability allowed the Brotherhood to establish influence even in areas where formal governance was absent or contested, including irradiated zones, urban ruins, and settlements under threat from raiders, supermutants, or the Enclave, demonstrating that expansion was as much a function of perceived legitimacy as it was of brute strength. Central to the Brotherhood's strategy of expansion was the careful placement and management of outposts, fortresses, and retrieval missions, which served multiple purposes simultaneously. They acted as repositories of technology, training centers for new initiates, logistical hubs for operations, and symbols of ideological authority in regions often dominated by chaos and lawlessness. And through these nodes, the Order was able to extend both influence and operational reach without overextending resources or compromising doctrinal rigor, a balance that ensured sustainable growth while preserving the cohesion, discipline, and identity that had historically defined the Brotherhood, and allowing even distant chapters to contribute meaningfully to the Order's strategic objectives. The Brotherhood's influence was not limited to direct control or military dominance, for its presence and reputation carried a weight that extended into the political, economic, and social spheres of the wasteland, shaping interactions between independent settlements, nascent regional governments, and other factions, many of whom recognized the necessity of either aligning with the Brotherhood or accommodating its objectives to avoid conflict or gain access to technology, supplies, and training, and thus the Order wielded soft power alongside hard power, establishing itself as a gatekeeper of knowledge, a mediator of disputes, and a stabilizing force in regions where ungoverned violence threatened human survival, an influence that reinforced the perception of the Brotherhood as indispensable, even to those who might otherwise view it with suspicion or hostility. Expansion also required the development of a coherent doctrine of engagement, for while the early Brotherhood emphasized isolationism and the preservation of technology for its own sake, the exigencies of operating across multiple regions with diverse threats necessitated a nuanced approach that balanced moral imperatives, operational necessity, and long-term strategy, and this evolution is particularly evident in the Capital Wasteland and later Mojave chapters, where leaders such as Elder Lyons and eventually Arthur Maxson codified policies regarding the selective distribution of technology, intervention in conflicts, and collaboration with outside actors when consistent with the overarching mission of safeguarding humanity and pre-war knowledge, a philosophy that ensured both the effectiveness and legitimacy of expansionist operations while preserving the core identity of the Order. The Brotherhood's expansion also created opportunities for ideological influence, as their recruitment and training programs imbued new initiates with both martial discipline and a codified ethical framework regarding the use of technology, instilling a sense of identity, purpose, and loyalty that extended the Order's cultural influence beyond its immediate operational footprint. And in doing so, the Brotherhood established a network of personnel who were not only warriors but also custodians of a moral and technological philosophy capable of guiding human development and shaping societal outcomes according to the precepts of stewardship, responsibility, and selective empowerment, an approach that reinforced both internal cohesion and external legitimacy. Military campaigns and strategic interventions further solidified the Brotherhood's influence, as deployments to neutralize supermutant threats, contest Raider dominance, or confront the Enclave reinforced their operational authority, demonstrated the practical superiority of disciplined technology stewardship, and created a legacy of intervention that was both feared and respected, establishing the Order as a central actor in defining the balance of power in multiple regions, with victories not only enhancing their prestige, but also setting precedents for ethical engagement, tactical doctrine, the practical use of pre-war technology in a world where uncontrolled application could result in catastrophe, and thereby reinforcing the perception of the Brotherhood as the ultimate arbiter of technological power in the wasteland. The influence of the Brotherhood extended to economic and technological spheres as well, as the recovery, repair, and redistribution of pre-war machinery, energy systems, and weaponry had cascading effects on the viability of settlements, the competitiveness of regional powers, and the relative balance of human populations, for by controlling access to functional technology, the Order could indirectly determine which communities thrived, which factions endured, and which actors were marginalized or neutralized, and this capacity to shape societal outcomes through technological stewardship further enhanced their authority and ensured that expansion was both strategic and enduring, reinforcing the central tenet that knowledge and power, when combined with discipline and moral oversight, confer influence that extends far beyond immediate combat operations. Finally, the Brotherhood's expansion and influence cannot be understood apart from the symbolic and psychological dimensions of their presence, for the visual and cultural markers of the Order, power, armor, ritualized ranks, sacred bunkers, and disciplined operations, conveyed authority, inspired awe, and instilled compliance even in regions where the Order was physically absent, and this projection of symbolic power magnified their influence across the wasteland, ensuring that their operational reach extended beyond direct engagement, creating a network of perceptions, alliances, and deterrence that reinforced the Order's strategic position and allowed it to shape events over vast territories. And in doing so, the Brotherhood of Steel emerged not only as a military and technological power, but as a defining institution of post-apocalyptic civilization, whose expansion, influence, and doctrinal cohesion have allowed it to endure, adapt, and assert authority across generations, regions, and crises, shaping the destiny of humanity while remaining true to its foundational mission of safeguarding technology, preserving knowledge, and guiding civilization according to the ethical and moral precepts codified by Roger Maxson and perfected by his descendants. In the modern era of Fallout lore, the Brotherhood of Steel has come to occupy a uniquely multifaceted position within the tapestry of post-apocalyptic civilization, serving simultaneously as a martial power, a technological custodian, a philosophical authority, and a symbol of continuity that links the shattered remnants of pre-war society to the evolving political, social, and cultural dynamics of the wasteland. For the Order's presence is not merely tactical or material, but narrative, operating at the intersection of history, legend, and strategic influence, and its actions, decisions, and ideology have profound consequences for the way both in-universe populations and the player community interpret the moral and structural framework of survival in a world defined by scarcity, chaos, and the legacy of nuclear catastrophe. As the Fallout series has expanded across multiple games, regions, and generations, the Brotherhood has evolved from a relatively isolated faction in California into a continent-spanning force whose mythos, philosophy, and operational doctrine are central to understanding the interplay between technology, power, and morality in the post-apocalyptic setting. The modern lore portrays the Brotherhood as a highly disciplined and hierarchical organization, one whose internal cohesion, martial capabilities, and technological supremacy distinguish it from all other factions in the wasteland, and whose enduring commitment to the preservation of pre-war knowledge has positioned it as both a guardian and arbiter of civilization's legacy, even as the external environment grows increasingly complex with the rise of new political entities, regional alliances, and independent communities, and with the resurgence of threats such as the Enclave, super mutants, raider conglomerates, and other emergent dangers, all of which require a combination of doctrinal fidelity, operational competence, and moral judgment to navigate effectively. In this context, the Brotherhood functions not merely as a participant in historical events, but as a stabilizing framework for the interpretation of post-war survival. influencing both the practical and philosophical dimensions of conflict, governance, and technological stewardship across multiple settings and narratives. The Capital Wasteland iteration, as detailed in Fallout 3, emphasizes the Brotherhood's role as a moral and technological bulwark against existential threats, particularly the Enclave, whose genocidal ambitions crystallize the consequences of technological misuse. And the narrative surrounding the Lone Wanderer illustrates the Order's capacity to combine mentorship, selective intervention, and operational support in ways that extend its influence without compromising doctrinal integrity, providing a nuanced portrayal of a faction that is neither fully benevolent nor tyrannical, but rather pragmatic, disciplined, and ethically oriented according to its long-standing mission. And this depiction reinforces the broader themes of stewardship, responsibility, and moral complexity that define modern Fallout storytelling. In the Mojave Wasteland, chronicled in Fallout New Vegas, the Brotherhood's presence is more contentious, reflecting the ongoing tension between isolationist doctrine and practical engagement with external communities, and highlighting how regional adaptations of the Order's philosophy can lead to divergent interpretations and interactions with local populations, such as the New California Republic and independent settlements, as well as hostile entities, including raiders and mutated threats. And these interactions underscore the Order's dual identity as both protector and enforcer, demonstrating that while their power and technology confer authority, their influence is contingent upon negotiation, perception, and the moral credibility established through centuries of consistent doctrine and disciplined operation, thereby reinforcing their narrative role as a touchstone for ethical and strategic decision-making within the Wasteland. The reunification of the Brotherhood under Arthur Maxson further cements the Order's place in modern law, portraying a disciplined, continent-spanning organization capable of projecting military, technological, and ideological power across the post-apocalyptic landscape, and whose strategic, operational, and moral coherence serves as a model for both in-universe characters and players seeking to understand the consequences of technological stewardship, hierarchical authority, and ethical governance in a context where failure can lead to catastrophic loss of life, civilization, and knowledge. This narrative positioning elevates the Brotherhood from a regional faction to a central pillar of the post-apocalyptic mythos, with decisions, actions, and internal dynamics that resonate across multiple storylines, game worlds, and player choices, demonstrating the enduring relevance and adaptability of the Order within the evolving canon of the Fallout universe. Modern lore also emphasizes the ideological tensions within the Brotherhood, particularly between traditionalists who favor strict preservationist doctrine, pragmatists who advocate selective engagement with the Wasteland, and expansionists who seek to project power and influence in a way that safeguards both technology and human populations. And these internal dynamics provide a rich narrative lens for exploring questions of authority, morality, and governance, while also creating a framework for understanding the consequences of leadership, succession, and factional alignment. The series' narratives, whether through player interaction, quest lines, or environmental storytelling, consistently highlight how these internal debates shape strategic decisions, operational priorities, and the ethical framework guiding the Brotherhood's actions, reinforcing its role as a narrative anchor in the broader post-apocalyptic world. The technological and martial assets of the Brotherhood further enhance their narrative significance in modern lore. For the Order's mastery of power, armor, energy weapons, pre-war schematics, and experimental technology creates both tangible and symbolic markers of authority, allowing them to influence the behavior of NPC factions, shape the outcomes of conflicts, and reinforce the central themes of responsibility, stewardship, and moral judgment. And this narrative function extends to player engagement, as interactions with the Brotherhood often require strategic choices, ethical deliberation, and long-term consideration of consequences, reflecting the series' broader thematic emphasis on the interplay between power, morality, and human survival, and situating the Brotherhood as both a narrative and operational arbiter within the game world. Finally, the Brotherhood's role in modern Fallout lore is inseparable from its symbolic and mythological dimensions, for the image of steel-clad knights, hidden bunkers, and disciplined hierarchies embodies the enduring themes of civilization, order, and technological stewardship in a world otherwise defined by chaos, scarcity, and moral ambiguity, and these symbols serve as both aspirational and cautionary exemplars, illustrating the potential for both protection and tyranny, guidance and rigidity, and continuity and adaptation, thereby ensuring that the Brotherhood remains central to the moral, operational, and mythological framework of the series, and solidifying its status as one of the most enduring and complex factions in the Fallout universe, whose influence continues to resonate across generations, regions, and narratives, shaping the ethical, strategic, and existential contours of the post-apocalyptic wasteland. The legacy and cultural impact of the Brotherhood of Steel extend far beyond its immediate military, technological, and operational achievements, embedding the Order deeply into the mythology, ethics, and socio-political dynamics of the post-apocalyptic world. For the Brotherhood's existence has shaped not only the survival strategies and governance structures of countless human communities, but also the way in which the wasteland itself interprets authority, knowledge, and the moral use of technology, establishing a framework in which the possession, control, and judicious application of pre-war systems confer both power and responsibility, a principle that has informed interactions between factions, individual survival choices, and the broader cultural imagination, both within the Fallout universe and among the communities of players who engage with its narrative and ethical landscapes. The Brotherhood's influence is simultaneously tangible, manifested in the fortresses they maintain, the power armor they deploy, and the weapons they control, and intangible, expressed through the ethical, philosophical, and symbolic resonance of their mission, which casts them as both guardians of civilization and exemplars of the complex interplay between authority, morality, and survival in a world shaped by nuclear devastation. The Order's cultural impact is evident in the way its ideology, symbols, and practices have been internalized, contested, and adapted by other factions, settlements, and individuals across the wasteland. For the image of the Brotherhood, its power-armored knights, sacred bunkers, advanced technology, and hierarchical discipline has become a shorthand for both the preservation of knowledge and the exercise of moral and martial authority, a dual role that positions the Order as a touchstone of civilization in a fragmented, chaotic environment, and which informs the behavior, alignment, and ambitions of other actors in the wasteland, whether they seek alliance, emulation, confrontation, or subversion. In this sense, the Brotherhood functions as a cultural benchmark, shaping the values, fears, and aspirations of human communities, while simultaneously asserting its own narrative as the ultimate arbiters of what constitutes worthy technological and moral stewardship. The Brotherhood's influence also extends into narrative and myth-making within the lore itself. For the Order embodies the tension between preservation and intervention, discipline and pragmatism, moral authority and coercive power, and these tensions are reflected in the stories of heroes, villains, and survivors who interact with the faction, whether through direct engagement, observation, or the interpretation of their deeds and artifacts. The recurring appearance of the Brotherhood across multiple games, regions, and generations underscores its role as a stabilizing narrative device, offering players a framework through which to explore ethical dilemmas, strategic planning, and the consequences of technological control, while also reinforcing the notion that civilization in the wasteland is inseparable from the management of knowledge and the enforcement of moral and martial discipline principles embodied in the Order's operational and symbolic practices. Historically, the Brotherhood's legacy is defined by its ability to endure fragmentation, schism, and geographic dispersion, while maintaining doctrinal continuity, hierarchical cohesion, and operational effectiveness, a phenomenon that has both narrative and cultural significance, for it demonstrates that institutional identity and ethical commitment can persist across centuries, even in the face of catastrophic social and environmental collapse, and that the preservation of knowledge and technology is inseparable from the cultivation of authority, discipline, and ethical stewardship. This durability is reflected in the reunification under Arthur Maxson, the consolidation of the Western, Eastern, and Midwestern chapters, and the sustained capacity of the Brotherhood to project influence, protect human populations, and shape regional outcomes, highlighting the Order's ability to convert moral and technological principles into enduring structural and cultural power. The symbolic power of the Brotherhood is reinforced by its ritual, hierarchy, and martial culture, for ceremonies, ranks, and traditions serve not only to instill discipline and operational competence, but also to embed a shared sense of purpose and identity that transcends individual lifespan, regional variation, and environmental contingencies. And this cultural continuity ensures that the values of technological stewardship, ethical oversight, and selective intervention are transmitted consistently across generations, reinforcing the notion that the Order is more than a faction. It is a civilization-scale institution, a moral and operational archetype, and a repository of cultural memory whose influence persists even in the absence of direct intervention, shaping both the lived experience and the mythos of the wasteland. Beyond its operational and narrative influence, the Brotherhood's legacy also encompasses its role as a cautionary and aspirational exemplar in the ethical discourse of the wasteland, illustrating the consequences of centralized authority, technological control, and doctrinal rigidity, while simultaneously providing a model for disciplined stewardship, moral judgment, and the responsible application of power. And this duality is central to their cultural resonance, offering a framework for evaluating the choices of other factions, communities, and individuals in a world where ethical clarity is rare and survival often demands compromise. The faction's enduring presence, formidable technology, and disciplined operations thus function as both a standard and a challenge, provoking reflection, emulation, and critique across the wasteland, and reinforcing the idea that the future of humanity is inseparable from the management of knowledge, power, and ethical responsibility. Finally, the cultural impact of the Brotherhood extends beyond the confines of the in-universe world, influencing the perception of post-apocalyptic ethics, governance, and technological stewardship in the broader player community and narrative engagement. for the faction serves as a lens through which the consequences of moral and strategic decision-making can be explored in a controlled but consequential environment, allowing players to grapple with questions of authority, loyalty, morality, and the responsible use of power while navigating the complex socio-political landscape of the wasteland. And in doing so, the Brotherhood of Steel transcends its fictional boundaries, emerging as both a narrative anchor and a philosophical touchstone, whose legacy continues to shape the mythology, ethics, and cultural understanding of civilization in the Fallout universe, ensuring that its influence endures across generations, regions, and storytelling media, and securing its place as one of the most iconic, enduring, and morally complex institutions in post-apocalyptic fiction.